Hi, my name is Ruth Fortis, and today I'm going to talk to you about inter-rater agreement. So, unlike grading a multiple choice test or even a situation where you're allotting points to short open-ended questions, rating a performance task is usually a very complex enterprise. There are so many things to which you have to pay attention, okay? Think of an oral presentation. You have to think about the content. You have to think about the organization. You have to think about the vocabulary and the grammar and the pronunciation and the fluency, and you have to think about that all at once and online. In high-stakes situations where the grade is important, very important to the student, then you may decide to have more than one teacher rate student performance on the task. So now we're going to talk about some aspects of that rating process and how to estimate whether you and your fellow raters are doing a good job. The rating process is basically a measurement based on observation and judgment. But everyone observes things differently, and judging a performance is a very subjective act. Now, that's where rubrics come in handy, and I hope you had the opportunity to listen to the previous presentation on the site about rubrics. They're really an essential part of the measurement process, okay? Why is that? First of all, rubrics help to clarify the important elements of the task, and they provide standards against which you can compare your personal subjective judgment. Well, that's nice, but what if teachers interpret the rubric differently? That's also part of the game. I mean, it's nice that the objective standards are written down there, but you can sometimes apply, you've got the objective standards, but when you try to apply it to a product, you and another rater may come up with different grades. So, how are you going to achieve dependable results? Well, first of all, let's take a hypothetical situation where there's two raters, okay? You and a colleague. First of all, you should each rate a few examples of the product independently of each other. That means, I don't know, if you've got a class of with 30 students and you've got 30 essays to rate, so you should maybe do 2 or 3, and your colleagues should do the same, 2 to 3 essays, and do them independently without talking to each other, okay? Now, if you're talking, and just in parentheses here, I want to say that if you're talking about an oral presentation, you should make a video of them so that they can be rated properly after the fact. And now every smartphone has a camera, and everyone or almost everyone has a smartphone, so this doesn't require any sophisticated equipment. But that was just an aside. After you've each rated the product, a few products, then you get together and you compare notes with the other rater, and you see what are the grades that you gave on each dimension for a particular product. And if you're very lucky, you will both have given exactly the same grades all across the board, and then your rubric is good and you're both excellent raters. But sometimes there may be discrepancies. Could be small discrepancies, could be big discrepancies, but what you need to do is talk about how you interpreted the rubric and try to reach agreement among the two of you. Okay, why were you high and the other person was low, or vice versa? Your goal in this process is to ensure that performance ratings reflect the student's true capabilities and are not a function of the perceptions and biases of the person evaluating the performance. Now, don't get me wrong, Everybody has perceptions and biases, no matter how expert and professional they are, but you're striving to make what is essentially a subjective process as objective as possible. You're not going to get there 100% because it can't be objective. We're talking about people, but you can try and eliminate as much of the error in measurement as you possibly can. Okay, so you want to make the process as systematic and as objective as it can be. And when it's done properly, the ratings of a performance assessment task can produce dependable results. That means results that are both reliable and valid. So let's say you did all that and you talked with your colleague and you adjusted your discrepancies, and now you feel that you both have a pretty good understanding of the rubric. So how do you know, after all this whole calibrating process, how do you know whether you were successful? Because, of course, there's no guarantee that on the rest of the essays, you're going to give exactly the same grade. So, first of all, let's talk a minute about some terminology. You can talk about inter-rater reliability, or inter-rater agreement, or concordance. And all of these things basically mean the same thing. To what degree did you and your fellow rater agree on the grades you gave for each dimension and in the summing in the total for the product as well, okay? So we're talking about the degree of consensus or homogeneity among judges. Now, this is just a personal preference of mine. I prefer to use the term inter-rater agreement, as you can see from the title of this presentation, because although you may hear the term inter-rater reliability used, but it's not really reliability at all. Because reliability tells you how accurately you are measuring something. Whereas here we're looking at consensus between people and not the degree to which the ability is being measured precisely. So that was just a short explanation about why I prefer to call it inter-rater. So how do you estimate inter-rater agreement? And there's a little formula that's just popped up there. Do not panic, do not panic. Ignore it for a minute. So when you're talking about categorical data, grades that are being given on a nominal or ordinal scale, and basically that means everything that's not numbers, okay? If the grade you're giving is not 1, 2, 3, 4, but poor, needs improvement, good, and excellent, if you're giving a rating in words, that's categorical data. So how do you calculate the inter-rater agreement for categorical data? You take the number of agreements and you divide them by the total number of observations. For example, if two teachers are rating the essays of 40 students and they found out that they gave 32 students the same rating from each teacher, which means that 8 got different scores, then the inter-rater agreement is 32. That's the total number of agreements between the two teachers, divided by 40, which is the total number of observations, and then you get an 80% agreement. Okay? For continuous data, that's scores that are given on an interval scale, and basically that means numbers, anything that's reported as a number. You calculate the correlation between the two ratings, and that little equation there on the right is the formula for calculating correlations. R is the symbol for correlation. It's the correlation between rater X and rater Y, and there's a sigma of standard scores on the top divided by N. I'm not going to go into that. But you can calculate correlations by using an Excel spreadsheet, or some of you may have access to SPSS or SAS programs at work. It's not such a difficult thing to do. And that will give you the the degree of the correlation, which can go from -1, which means that the ranking of one person was exactly opposite to the ranking of the other, or it can go up to +1, which means that you both ranked the students in exactly the same order. Now, the problem with correlations, and this is just a little bit of statistics, which, forgive me, but I have to put this in here. Correlations talk about rankings, okay? The ranking of, let's say, from the highest to the lowest of rater A, and the ranking of the highest to the lowest for rater B, and then they see how much those two rankings agree with each other. That's what the correlation tells you. But there's a problem with correlations, and that is, consider a case where you have 4 essays. Rater A gives the following 4 scores, okay? The first essay gets a 1, the second essay gets a 2, the third essay gets a 1, and the fourth essay gets the score of 3. Rater B rates the same essays in the same order and gives the scores of 2, 3, 2, and 4, respectively, okay? Now, what happens is that when you calculate a correlation for these two sets of scores, you get a perfect correlation because the raters ranked the students in exactly the same order. Okay, they gave the highest score to the same student, the last one. They gave the lowest scores to the same students, the first and the third students. Okay, and they gave average scores to the second student. So your correlation will come out perfectly, whereas in actual fact, there was no agreement on the score given to any of the essays. So correlations are kind of a tricky thing to look at. Sometimes they can mislead you a little bit. But you can also use the system for calculating inter-rater agreement for categorical data. You can also do that for interval scale data. So now that you've done all your calculations, what is good inter-rater agreement and what is not so good inter-rater agreement? So this is just by convention. There's no hard and fast rules anywhere, okay? But consensus among measurement people says that an agreement between 0.4 to 0.59 is moderate. Between 0.6 to 0.79 is substantial. And anything over 0.8 is outstanding agreement. What happens if you've got an agreement of 0.4 or 0.3? Or let's say there was a substantial agreement, but that's not good enough. You want to reach outstanding. So if there isn't enough agreement between two raters, then there's two things that might be the source of the problem. First of all, your rubric may not be a good rubric. It may not be clear enough. The performance standards may not be detailed enough. It may leave too much to subjective judgment. And the other possibility is that even though the rubric is okay, the raters need to be trained or retrained on that particular rubric. There's one more thing I want to talk about, and that is intra-rater agreement, and that's agreement between the rater and herself or himself. The degree to which a rater is consistent over time, and I know all of you have spent probably hours grading student work, okay? And you know you can be affected by the mood you're in, by how much you slept that night. You may also be affected by identification of the respondent. You've got their name there on the paper, or you might recognize their handwriting. And sometimes an answer from a failing student may be more critically analyzed than the same response from someone you know is a good student. And again, all of us tend to have these biases, or your bias may be the other way around. You might see an answer from a failing student and you think, oh, they're trying so hard, I'm going to go easy on them. Whereas the exact same answer from a really good student, you might say, well, you know, that's okay for an average student, but this is a good student and I expect more. So just try and be aware of your own personal biases and try as much as possible to correct for them and not let the identity of the student cloud your judgment too much. In order to improve your intra-rater agreement, you should periodically refer back to the rubric throughout the scoring process. In other words, don't just read it once in the beginning and then forget about it, but every few essays or every few products, whatever it is you're rating, go back to the rubric, or you can do it with everyone. Look back at the performance standards, compare, try and calibrate yourself again and again and again towards the rubric. You need to do this because sometimes what happens is what psychologists call the halo effect. In other words, you just rated an essay that was absolutely fantastic. Really, really, really good. The next essay is from a student who's not such a great student. Poor guy. The student just came after someone who's really brilliant, and automatically our brains compare what we're seeing now to what's most recent in our memory. Okay, so this poor student is going to be compared to this brilliant one, and the grade might suffer because of that. But if you try and forget that you just graded a brilliant essay and just take the essay as is from the not so brilliant student and compare it to the rubric, that's something that can try and that you can do to help overcome what we call the halo effect. It could be the other way around, too. You could have graded a really awful essay, and then the next one you grade is from a brilliant student, and you say, oh, wow, well, look, in comparison to that, they really should get the highest score. Whereas what you have to do is take the brilliant essay and compare it back to the rubric and be objective about it. Now, another way to overcome our subjective biases, things that we kind of assume implicitly but may not make explicit to our own selves, is by sharing the rubric ahead of time with the students and listening to what they say or their questions or their comments on the rubric. And sometimes that process of discussing it with the students allows you to discover things that you thought were obvious or understood but are not that obvious and clear to everyone else. So that's another thing you can do to improve your own calibration with yourself. Thank you for listening.